Welcome back to Mr. Fear. Tonight we're taking a journey deep into the heart of Kentucky, a state where, as many will tell you, the dead often refuse to stay buried. In this episode, we're going to delve into 8 spine-tingling cemetery encounters that will undoubtedly make you question everything you thought you knew about the afterlife. From the hallowed historic grounds of Louisville's Cave Hill Cemetery to forgotten, overgrown burial sites dotted across the bluegrass state, these are the truly unnerving stories that arise from Kentucky's most haunted graveyards. Every single account we share has been thoroughly researched and meticulously documented, drawing from first-hand testimonies of people who know these places intimately. Groundskeepers, historians, curious photographers, and even ordinary folks who unexpectedly found themselves face-to-face with the supernatural among the tombstones. These aren't just fictional tales designed to scare. They are genuine, deeply unsettling encounters reported by individuals who lived through experiences that defy all logical explanation. To protect the privacy of those involved, some names and specific locations have been altered. But rest assured, the authentic terror and chilling reality remain absolutely intact. From lonely night shifts that took a terrifying turn to genealogy research that inadvertently stirred sleeping spirits, these stories will take you beyond the veil, to a place where Kentucky's restless departed continue their eternal watchful vigil. If you're new here, please be sure to subscribe to Fear Files for daily true horror content that promises to send shivers down your spine. And don't forget to hit that notification bell, so you're always updated when the darkness beckons from beyond the grave. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and in 2019 I relocated to Louisville from Houston to attend the University of Louisville. Like most college students, I was perpetually short on cash, constantly on the lookout for a job that paid decently and wouldn't clash with my demanding class schedule. That's precisely how I ended up working the night shift as a groundskeeper at Calvary Cemetery, one of Louisville's oldest burial grounds, established way back in 1846. Initially, the job seemed absolutely ideal. I worked from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Monday through Friday, which left my days completely free for studies. The pay was surprisingly good for what appeared to be simple maintenance work. My supervisor, an older gentleman named Bill who had been there for over 2 decades, mentioned that most people weren't exactly keen on working alone in a cemetery all night, hence the premium wage. He laughed as he said it, but I distinctly caught a flicker in his eyes that hinted he wasn't entirely joking. The cemetery itself stretched across nearly 40 acres of rolling hills, dotted with ornate Victorian memorials, plain headstones, and grand family mausoleums that resembled small, Gothic-style crypts. Towering oak trees formed such a dense canopy that, even on moonlit nights, much of the grounds remained cloaked in profound darkness. My duties were straightforward: patrol for vandalism or trespassers, maintain landscaping equipment, and handle minor repairs that couldn't wait until morning. Bill provided me with a golf cart to navigate the winding paths and a 2-way radio to contact the security company if any issues arose. For the first 3 weeks, the job was everything I'd hoped for. I'd spend my nights listening to podcasts while trimming hedges, clearing fallen branches, or simply walking the peaceful grounds. The silence was profound, unlike anything city life had ever offered. Even the distant traffic from nearby streets seemed faint and far away. I found myself actually enjoying the solitude and the strange, haunting beauty of the place at night. The elaborate sculptures and weathered headstones took on an almost eerie, captivating aura under the soft glow of my flashlight. The only peculiar thing I noticed during those early weeks was how abruptly the temperature seemed to drop in certain sections. There were pockets of truly cold air that chilled you to the bone, even on warm September nights. I assumed it was due to the hills and trees creating microclimates, though I'd never experienced anything quite like it before. These cold spots weren't random either. They consistently appeared in the same specific locations. Near the oldest section of the cemetery where headstones were almost illegible, around a particular mausoleum belonging to the Whitman family, and along a narrow path Bill had strictly warned me to avoid after midnight. When I questioned him about that restriction in my 4th week, Bill became unsettlingly grave. He explained that the back section, beyond the newer graves and past a grove of twisted cedar trees, was where the indigent and unclaimed were buried in the early days. The graves there were unmarked, and the ground was uneven, potentially dangerous to navigate in the dark. He insisted it was purely a safety concern, but the way he averted his gaze when he spoke told me there was much more to the story. It was on a Thursday night in early October when everything truly shifted. I was following my usual routine, starting in the eastern section and gradually moving west. The night held an eerie stillness. No wind stirred the foliage, and even the owls, usually a constant soundtrack, were eerily silent. As I neared the Whitman Mausoleum around 2 a.m., I encountered one of those familiar cold spots, but this time it was intensely different. The temperature plummeted so severely that my breath immediately became visible, and the cold penetrated my heavy jacket straight to my bones. That's when I heard it for the first time, a soft, insistent scratching sound like fingernails dragging across stone. I stopped walking and listened intently, my heart thumping, trying desperately to pinpoint the source. It seemed to be coming from inside the mausoleum itself. I cautiously approached the ornate iron gate sealing the entrance and shone my flashlight through the bars. The beam illuminated marble walls and what appeared to be several stone coffins within the chamber. Everything looked normal, but the scratching continued, now accompanied by what sounded like faint whispered voices. I tried to convince myself it must be an animal, perhaps a raccoon or a possum, trapped inside. I made a mental note to ask Bill in the morning about getting someone to investigate. But as I turned to walk away, the scratching abruptly stopped, and I heard something that made my blood run absolutely cold. A voice clear as day called my name. Not shouting, not urgent, just a calm conversational tone saying, "Marcus," as if someone was trying to get my attention. I spun around, my flashlight beam wildly searching, expecting to see another person, perhaps a late-night visitor or a security guard, but I was completely, terrifyingly alone. The silence had returned, thick and oppressive, making my ears ring. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but received no response. I waited several minutes, scanning the area with my flashlight and listening for any further sounds. When nothing else happened, I decided to continue my patrol, though I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The next night, I opted to start my rounds in a different section, hoping to avoid whatever had so unnerved me near the Whitman Mausoleum. I began in the newer part of the cemetery, where the headstones were more modern and the paths better maintained. Everything seemed normal until around 1:30 a.m. when I realized, with a growing sense of unease, that I was being followed. It started as just a feeling, that distinct sensation of being observed that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. But then I began to notice subtle, undeniable signs. The faint sound of footsteps on gravel that would cease whenever I stopped walking, shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees swaying in the breeze, and always those patches of impossibly cold air that seemed to follow me. I tried desperately to rationalize what was happening. Maybe another employee I hadn't been told about, or perhaps the security company was conducting their own patrols. But when I radioed the dispatcher to ask if anyone else was supposed to be on the grounds, she confirmed I was the only person scheduled. She asked if I wanted someone to check on me, but I declined, not wanting to seem paranoid or incapable of handling the job. By 3 a.m., the sense of being followed had become so intense, so palpable, that I could no longer focus on my work. Every shadow seemed to conceal a figure. Every sound of settling leaves or creaking branches made me jump out of my skin. I decided to return to the maintenance shed early and spend the rest of my shift doing paperwork and equipment checks. But as I drove the golf cart back along the main path, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes, almost tumbling out of the seat in sheer shock. Standing directly in front of me, perhaps 20 feet away, was a figure in what appeared to be period attire. It was a woman, though I couldn't clearly make out her face in the darkness. She wore a long dress that swayed and rippled without a single breath of wind. Her hair was long and dark, and she stood perfectly still, as if patiently waiting for me. I called out to her, my voice trembling, asking if she needed help or was lost, but she didn't respond. She just stood there watching me with an unnerving stillness. I reached for my flashlight to get a better look, my hand shaking. But when I raised the beam to where she had been standing, there was nothing there. The path was completely, utterly empty. I sat in the golf cart for several minutes, my heart racing, trying to process what I had just seen, to convince myself it wasn't real. I slowly drove to the spot where the figure had been and carefully examined the ground. There were no footprints in the soft earth, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The rest of that night passed without incident, but I couldn't for the life of me dispel the vivid image of the woman in the old-fashioned dress. When I got home that morning, I spent hours researching the history of Calvary Cemetery online. I learned it had been the final resting place for thousands of Louisville residents over more than a century and a half. Many of the oldest graves belonged to victims of cholera outbreaks, yellow fever epidemics, and other tragedies that had struck the city in the 19th century. The descriptions I found of burial practices and funeral attire from that era matched what I had seen: long dresses, elaborate mourning clothes, and formal burial garments common for women of that period. I seriously considered quitting the job right then, but I desperately needed the money. Instead, I decided to adjust my routine. I would stick to the newer sections of the cemetery, avoid the areas where I'd experienced the strange phenomena, and complete my shifts as quickly and efficiently as possible. For the next week, this strategy seemed to work. I encountered no more unseen presences or unexplained sounds, though the cold spots remained, and I continued to sense an inexplicable gaze whenever I ventured near the older sections. It was on the following Thursday night, exactly 2 weeks after my first supernatural encounter, that I had the experience that finally convinced me to find another job. I was completing my final patrol of the night around 6 a.m., just as the eastern sky was showing the first hints of dawn. I was driving past the section of the cemetery Bill had warned me to avoid, the area where the indigent and unclaimed were buried, when the golf cart's motor abruptly died. The engine simply cut out without warning, and all attempts to restart it failed. I was stranded about a quarter-mile from the maintenance shed in the oldest and most isolated part of the cemetery. I had no choice but to walk back. But as I started down the path, a chilling realization washed over me. I wasn't alone. The woman in the old-fashioned dress was there again. But this time she wasn't standing in the distance. She was walking beside me, matching my pace exactly, staying just at the edge of my peripheral vision. Whenever I turned my head to look directly at her, she would dissolve into thin air, only to reappear subtly at my side. But I could feel her presence constantly, a cool, quiet energy. As we walked together through the pre-dawn darkness, I began to hear other sounds around us. Distinct footsteps on gravel, though I could see no one else. Faint, whispered conversations and voices too soft to understand. The sound of crying, soft and sorrowful, coming from different directions as if carried on an unseen breeze. The temperature around me dropped so dramatically that frost began forming on the grass beneath my feet, even though it was still early October and the night had been relatively mild. But the most unnerving part was that I no longer felt afraid. Instead, I felt a profound wave of sorrow, a deep, pervasive grief, as if I was experiencing the collective sorrow of everyone who had ever been laid to rest in that silent, hallowed place. The woman beside me seemed to be trying to communicate something, an unspoken message, though I couldn't grasp what it was. When I finally reached the maintenance shed and looked back, she was gone. But I knew with absolute certainty that she had been there, guiding me safely through the darkness. I finished my shift that morning and never returned to Calvary Cemetery. I found a job waiting tables at a restaurant near campus, which paid less, but allowed me to sleep through the nights. I never told Bill the real reason I was quitting, just said I needed different hours. But sometimes, even now when I walk alone at night, I feel that familiar presence beside me, and I wonder if some connections, some profound grief or unfinished business, truly cross the divide between the living and the dead, keeping certain spirits forever tethered to the places they once called home, or the places where their earthly remains were finally laid to rest. These encounters remind us that history isn't always confined to books. Sometimes it whispers in the cold air, touches your arm in the darkness, and leaves an indelible mark on your soul. My name is Tyler Washington, and I'm an Atlanta-based photographer. What truly drives my work is a profound fascination with gothic and evocative visuals. For me, photography isn't just a job. It's a deep journey into the aesthetics of shadow, a way to capture the intricate dance of light and dark, and to reveal the hidden stories of places most people overlook, hurrying past without a second glance. For 6 years now, I've dedicated myself to a long-term project, documenting historic southern cemeteries, captivated by their unique blend of natural beauty, majestic architecture, and deep, palpable historical resonance. When it came time to plan my senior portfolio for my Master of Fine Arts degree at the Savannah College of Art and Design, I knew, without a doubt, that Kentucky would be absolutely central to my vision. The historic cemeteries scattered across this state are, in my opinion, some of the most stunning and emotionally resonant final resting places in the entire country. Imagine ornate Victorian memorials, ancient trees gracefully draped in Spanish moss, and rolling hills that provide truly breathtaking natural backdrops. They're a photographer's dream. I dedicated months to this preparation, scouting countless locations, immersing myself in historical documents, and meticulously planning the intricate technical strategies required for low-light photography. Ultimately, Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville emerged as the undeniable focal point of my entire Kentucky journey. Established way back in 1848, Cave Hill Cemetery, sprawling across 296 magnificent acres, is renowned not just for its immense historical significance, but also for its exquisitely designed landscapes and stunning architectural beauty. It's the final resting place for many prominent figures, including, perhaps most famously, Colonel Harlan Sanders of KFC. But what truly captivated me, what truly pulled me towards Cave Hill, was its reputation as one of the most visually mesmerizing graveyards in the entire region. Its Gothic revival edifices, grand, imposing mausoleums, and that ethereal quality of light that softly filters through its ancient oak and maple trees. It all creates an atmosphere unlike any other. I finally arrived at Cave Hill on a humid October evening, having carefully scheduled my visit to coincide with the new moon, a time when ambient light would be at its absolute minimum. This deliberate choice allowed me to truly capture that delicate, haunting dance between artificial and natural illumination, which, for me, is what gives cemetery photography its uniquely evocative mood. My arsenal for the night was extensive: 2 reliable DSLR bodies, a versatile array of lenses ranging from wide-angle to telephoto, a sturdy carbon fiber tripod, portable LED lights, and, crucially, enough battery power to sustain an entire night of intense shooting. The evening started out perfectly, almost miraculously so. The weather was simply ideal for photography. A soft, gentle mist hung in the air, lending an ethereal quality to the entire landscape without being so dense that it interfered with my visibility or equipment. I began my work near the cemetery's main entrance, meticulously documenting the intricate masonry of the Gothic Revival archway and those majestic bronze gates that have stood for over a century and a half, greeting countless visitors and mourners. These architectural details were, of course, superb subjects for my signature Gothic style, blending sacred symbolism with the rich artistry of Victorian funerary design. As the clock slowly crept towards midnight, I ventured deeper into Cave Hill's older, more ancient sections, where the memorials dated back to the very earliest days of the cemetery. This particular area absolutely captivated me, not just as a photographer, but as a passionate history enthusiast. Many of these graves belonged to families who were pivotal in Louisville's rapid growth during the 19th century, and their elaborate monuments beautifully reflected both their societal standing and the burial traditions so prevalent in their era. The artistry here was simply remarkable. Marble angels, their delicate features softened by over a century of Kentucky's relentless elements, towering obelisks that pierced 20 feet into the night sky, and majestic family mausoleums, each resembling a miniature Gothic cathedral. It was within this deeply historic section that I truly began to experiment with long exposure methods, leaving the camera shutter open for extended periods. This technique allowed me to capture the delicate, almost imperceptible drift of mist through the cemetery and observe how the moonlight dramatically sculpted striking shadows among the ancient memorials. Long exposure photography, especially in a graveyard, demands an immense amount of patience and absolute technical precision. Even the slightest camera shake during such a prolonged exposure can completely ruin a shot. My specific goal was to achieve what photographers refer to as light painting, using mobile light sources to trace luminous streaks and intricate patterns across the frame during that extended exposure time. During one particularly challenging shot, I meticulously set up my camera to capture a 30-second exposure of a cluster of Victorian-era markers nestled among ancient oak trees. The composition felt perfect, a silent dialogue between natural and man-made forms, the stark juxtaposition of dark, looming silhouettes against pale limestone, and the undeniable otherworldly essence of the rising mist. Once the exposure was complete, I eagerly inspected the image on my camera's display, double-checking the focus and exposure settings. But what I saw there, what truly appeared on that screen, fundamentally and irrevocably altered my entire evening at Cave Hill Cemetery. In the background of the image, barely visible at first glance, but then unmistakably there, was a semi-transparent form that seemed to be standing directly behind one of the larger headstones. The figure had the distinct silhouette and graceful stance of a woman in a flowing gown, her contour soft, faintly glowing against the darker cemetery backdrop. My initial rational reaction was to blame a technical glitch, perhaps lens fog, a stray reflection from one of my portable lights, or some kind of digital artifact inherent in the long exposure process itself. But professional intrigue, that insatiable curiosity, compelled me to delve deeper. I carefully moved my equipment closer to the exact spot where the figure had appeared and meticulously examined the area. There were absolutely no reflective elements, no stray light sources that could have caused a flare, and certainly no tangible items that could have been mistaken for a human form. I thoroughly cleaned my lenses, double-checked all my equipment settings, and then, with a growing sense of unease, I set up for another series of long exposures in that very same location. The outcome was, quite frankly, even more unnerving. Not only did the semi-transparent figure reappear, but this time it was accompanied by additional forms that seemed to shift and move between frames. By painstakingly comparing sequential images, I could clearly discern that these weren't merely fixed aberrations or digital quirks. They appeared to be in genuine motion through the cemetery, exhibiting patterns that strongly implied deliberate movement rather than random light effects. These ethereal shapes maintained consistent proportions and seemed to subtly engage with the physical environment of the cemetery, suggesting they possessed a tangible presence, even if they looked utterly ghostly in my photographs. As my photography session stretched past midnight, the activity paradoxically grew stronger, rather than diminishing. I began capturing images that revealed several forms at once, sometimes appearing to congregate with a sense of purpose around specific graves or memorials. These figures varied significantly in stature and apparent age, ranging from what looked like small children to fully grown adults. Their attire, too, hinted at distinct historical eras, seemingly spanning the entire history of the cemetery. Some donned the ornate funeral garments characteristic of the Victorian period, while others appeared in the plainer, simpler dress of earlier times. Perhaps the most profoundly unsettling aspect of these photographs was this. While I could see the figures with startling clarity in my camera's images, my own bare eyes could not discern them at all. Even when I was gazing directly at the very spots where my camera was simultaneously capturing what appeared to be undeniable supernatural manifestations, I saw absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. It felt as if the camera possessed some unique ability to perceive what lay beyond the range of ordinary human sight, offering fleeting glimpses into an alternate dimension that somehow coexisted with the physical graveyard itself. Around 1 a.m., a new idea sparked. I decided to experiment with the sound recording functions built into my camera equipment. Knowing that many modern DSLRs now include surprisingly good microphones for video capture, I wondered if the audio would pick up similar phenomena to what was so clearly appearing in my photographs. I meticulously set up my camera to record both video and audio, all while I continued taking still photographs, aiming to create the most comprehensive record possible of the strange happenings at Cave Hill. When I reviewed those audio recordings later, what I discovered was astonishing. My camera had indeed captured sounds that had been completely imperceptible to me during the actual session. The audio files contained what sounded like muffled whispers, though their words were far too indistinct and garbled to understand clearly. There were also faint noises akin to weeping, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel paths, and what truly sounded like children playing in the distance. But most unsettling of all were the moments when the audio seemed to distinctly catch my name being spoken, in voices that shifted eerily from a casual murmur to a distinct, pressing tone. The combined force of these visual and audio phenomena utterly convinced me that I was documenting something far beyond my initial artistic intentions. Yet strangely, instead of fear or a desire to flee, I found myself utterly captivated by the profound potential unfolding before me. As a photographer, I've always been drawn to subjects that challenge and question our common perceptions of reality. Here I realized I was potentially documenting reported paranormal phenomena, events so rarely captured with contemporary high-resolution gear. I made a decisive choice. I would focus my remaining time at Cave Hill on a particular section of the graveyard that seemed to pulse with the strongest paranormal energy. This area contained multiple family crypts dating from the 1870s and 1880s, structures that truly represented the pinnacle of Victorian funerary design, with their intricate stone masonry, stunning stained glass, and inner chambers designed for the perpetual rest of entire family lines. My historical research had revealed that several of these mausoleums housed the remains of families who had endured profound, heartbreaking losses, including numerous child deaths from devastating epidemics that had swept through Louisville during the late 19th century. As I painstakingly set up my equipment near the Harrington family crypt, the resting place for 5 children, tragically lost to an 1882 diphtheria outbreak, I experienced what I can only describe as the most profound paranormal event of my entire professional life. The temperature around that crypt plunged so sharply, so dramatically, that my breath instantly materialized into visible plumes, and frost began to coat my gear despite the otherwise mild and humid October night. The mist, which had been softly drifting through the cemetery all evening, now began to churn violently and condense around the mausoleum in formations that utterly defied any normal understanding of airflow. I started taking pictures as rapidly as my gear would allow, capturing frame after frame of the intensifying phenomena. The images revealed not just the semi-transparent figures I had been documenting earlier, but what appeared to be an entire congregation of spirits gathered around the crypt. These figures seemed to be actively engaging with one another and with the physical edifice itself, creating a scene that profoundly resembled a family gathering or a memorial event, playing out in a dimension running parallel to our own tangible world. The absolute pinnacle, the defining moment of that night, occurred as I was preparing for what I intended to be my very final photograph. I had meticulously set up a complex long exposure shot, designed to capture the entire crypt complex, employing various lighting setups to sculpt the shadows and dramatically emphasize its intricate architectural elements. Just as I pressed the shutter release to begin the 30-second exposure, every single one of my electronic devices failed simultaneously, all at once. Camera flashes discharged spontaneously without any activation. LCD screens pulsed erratically and displayed incomprehensible visuals, and batteries that had been fully charged mere moments earlier were abruptly, completely depleted. When I reviewed that final photograph the very next morning, I discovered that my camera had somehow captured something that, to this day, remains utterly unexplainable. The image itself was breathtaking, chilling, and profoundly moving. It showed the mausoleum utterly surrounded by scores of semi-transparent figures, adults and children alike, all remarkably clear and seemingly posing intentionally for the shot. Their faces, while spectral and somewhat indistinct, conveyed a truly astonishing spectrum of emotions, from profound sorrow to serene peace, and even, perhaps, a deep sense of thankfulness. Most remarkably, several of these figures appeared to be looking directly into the camera lens, as if they were fully conscious of being photographed and genuinely wished their presence to be formally recorded. That singular experience at Cave Hill Cemetery profoundly altered not only my photographic methodology, but also my fundamental understanding of the intricate relationship between art and the supernatural. What had initially begun as a conventional fine art photography project suddenly blurred all the lines between factual record and a deeply personal spiritual quest. The photographs I captured that night ultimately became the compelling centerpiece of my master's thesis exhibition, though I presented them thoughtfully as artistic interpretations rather than definitive, irrefutable proof of paranormal phenomena. Since that extraordinary October evening, I have returned to Cave Hill Cemetery countless times, always approaching it with immense respect for both its artistic possibilities and its undeniable spiritual significance. Each subsequent visit has yielded more images, continuing to record paranormal occurrences, though never again quite with the raw intensity of that transformative first night. I've also expanded my long-term endeavor to photograph historic Southern cemeteries, now including other locations where similar phenomena have been reported. This ongoing work is creating a growing, compelling archive of images that strongly suggest the veil between life and death is far, far thinner than most people ever realize. The photographs from Cave Hill Cemetery have since been exhibited in galleries across the Southeast, drawing significant interest from both esteemed art critics and dedicated investigators of the supernatural. While I steadfastly maintain my primary focus on the aesthetic value of this work, I simply cannot deny that these images document phenomena that profoundly transcend traditional photographic scope. They serve, in a way, as a tangible connection between our mortal realm and whatever endures after death, captured uniquely through the distinct viewpoint only a camera lens can offer. My work has truly taught me that cemeteries are far more than mere resting places for the departed. They are vibrant, resonant arenas where memory, feeling, and perhaps even consciousness itself persist in forms we are only just beginning to comprehend. Through the art of photography, I have been privileged to record what I believe is undeniable proof of this ongoing existence, celebrating both the rich Gothic photography tradition and the profound, enduring enigma of what lies past the threshold of death. This journey has transformed my artistic practice from merely observing the world to actively seeking out its hidden layers, its whispers, and its echoes. It has instilled in me a deeper respect for the intangible, a belief that beauty and mystery can coexist even in the most shadowed corners of our reality. Moreover, it's opened my eyes to the countless stories still waiting to be told, not just through historical archives, but through the very fabric of places themselves. My hope is that these photographs do more than simply document. I hope they invite viewers to pause, to question, and perhaps to feel the lingering presence of those who came before us, bridging the gap between the living and the eternally silent. It's a constant reminder that perception is a fragile lens, and there's always more to see, more to hear, if only we allow ourselves to truly look and listen. Please rewrite this script in a natural and fluent tone with proper grammar and punctuation. Make sure it sounds human, emotionally engaging, and easy to follow, while keeping the original meaning and message intact without heading, and more 100 words add related this script in the end. My name is Tyler Washington, and I'm a photographer from Atlanta who focuses on Gothic and evocative visuals. Photography is more than a mere career for me. It's a way to delve into the aesthetics of shadow, to record the dance of light and dark, and to uncover the narratives of overlooked sites that most people rush past. For the past 6 years, I've been on a long-term endeavor to photograph historic Southern cemeteries, drawn to their distinct blend of natural splendor, majestic architecture, and deep historical resonance. When I started planning my senior portfolio for my Master of Fine Arts degree at the Savannah College of Art and Design, I knew Kentucky would be a crucial location for my work. The state's historic cemeteries are some of the most stunning and deeply moving final resting places in the country, with their ornate Victorian memorials, venerable trees draped in Spanish moss, and rolling hills that create breathtaking natural settings for photography. I spent months scouting locations, poring over historical documents, and devising the technical strategies for low-light photography. Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville became the focal point of my Kentucky journey. Established in 1848 and sprawling across 296 acres, Cave Hill is celebrated not just for its historical weight, but also its exquisite landscape design and structural beauty. The cemetery serves as the final resting place for numerous prominent figures, including the legendary Colonel Harlan Sanders of KFC fame. But what truly drew me to Cave Hill was its reputation as one of the most visually captivating graveyards in the region. With its Gothic revival edifices, grand mausoleums, and the otherworldly quality of light that filters through its ancient oak and maple trees. I arrived at Cave Hill on a humid October evening, scheduling my trip for the new moon, when ambient light would be minimal. This allowed me to capture the delicate dance of artificial and natural illumination that gives cemetery photography its unique evocative mood. My gear for the evening included 2 DSLR bodies, an array of lenses from wide-angle to telephoto, a robust carbon fiber tripod, portable LED lights, and sufficient battery power for an entire night's shoot. The evening began perfectly. The weather was ideal for capturing images, with a soft mist that lent an ethereal quality to the landscape without being so heavy as to interfere with visibility or equipment function. I started near the cemetery's main entrance, documenting the detailed masonry of the Gothic Revival archway and the majestic bronze gates that have greeted both visitors and mourners for over a century and a half. The architectural details were superb subjects for my characteristic Gothic style, with their fusion of sacred symbolism and Victorian funerary art. As the clock neared midnight, I moved deeper into Cave Hill's older sections, where the memorials hailed from the cemetery's nascent period. This area fascinated me both as a photographer and as a history enthusiast. Many of the graves belonged to families pivotal in Louisville's growth during the 19th century, and their elaborate monuments mirrored both their societal standing and the burial traditions of their era. The artistry was remarkable. Marble angels with features softened by over a century of Kentucky's elements, obelisks that soared 20 feet skyward, and family mausoleums resembling small Gothic cathedrals. It was in this historic section that I began exploring long exposure methods, opening the camera shutter for extended periods to record the delicate drift of mist through the cemetery and how moonlight sculpted striking shadows among the memorials. Long exposure photography in graveyards demands patience and technical accuracy, as minimal camera shake during exposure can mar a shot. I was particularly interested in achieving what photographers call light painting results, where mobile light sources trace streaks and patterns across the frame during the extended exposure time. During one especially challenging photograph, I set up my camera to capture a 30-second exposure of a group of Victorian-era markers surrounded by ancient oak trees. The composition was perfect, the dialogue between natural and man-made forms, the stark juxtaposition of dark silhouettes and pale limestone, and the otherworldly essence of the rising mist. When the exposure was complete, I inspected the image on my camera's display, checking focus and exposure settings. What I saw in that review fundamentally altered my evening at Cave Hill Cemetery. In the background of the image, barely visible but unmistakable, was a semi-transparent form that seemed to stand behind one of the larger headstones. The figure had the silhouette and stance of a woman in a flowing gown, her contour soft and faintly glowing against the darker cemetery backdrop. At first, I initially blamed a technical glitch, perhaps lens fog, a stray reflection from one of my lights, or some kind of digital artifact from the long exposure process. Professional intrigue spurred me to delve deeper. I moved my equipment closer to the spot where the figure had appeared and carefully examined the area. There were no reflective elements, no light sources that could have caused a flare, and no tangible items that could have been mistaken for a human form. I thoroughly cleaned my lenses and checked all my equipment settings, then set up for another series of long exposures in the same location. The outcome was even more unnerving. Not only did the semi-transparent figure reappear, but this time it was accompanied by extra forms that seemed to move between frames. By comparing sequential images, I could see that these weren't fixed aberrations, but appeared to be in motion through the cemetery in patterns that implied deliberate movement, rather than chance light effects. The shapes held steady proportions and appeared to engage with the physical environment of the cemetery in ways that suggested they held a certain presence, even though they looked ghostly in the images. As my photography session continued past midnight, the activity grew stronger, not weaker. I began capturing images that showed several forms at once, sometimes appearing to congregate around particular graves or memorials. The figures differed in stature and perceived age, from what looked like children to adults, and their attire hinted at distinct historical eras spanning the cemetery's entire history. Some wore the ornate funeral garments characteristic of the Victorian period, while others appeared in the plainer dress of earlier times. The most unsettling aspect of these photographs was that while I could see the figures clearly in my camera's images, I could not discern them with my bare eyes. Even when I was looking directly at locations where my camera was simultaneously capturing obvious supernatural manifestations, I saw nothing unusual. It was as if the camera somehow perceived what lay beyond ordinary human sight, capturing glimpses of an alternate dimension coexisting with the physical graveyard. Around 1 a.m., I decided to experiment with the sound recording functions of my camera equipment. Many modern DSLRs include superior microphones for capturing video, and I wondered if the audio would pick up similar phenomena to what was appearing in my photographs. I set up my camera to record both video and audio, while I continued taking still photographs, creating a full record of the happenings at Cave Hill Cemetery. When I reviewed the audio recordings later, I found my camera had indeed recorded sounds imperceptible to me during the actual session. The audio files contained what sounded like muffled whispers, though their words were too indistinct and garbled to understand clearly. There were also noises akin to weeping, footsteps on gravel paths, and what might have been children playing in the distance. Most unsettling were times the audio seemed to catch my name being spoken, in voices that shifted from casual to pressing. The combination of visual and audio phenomena convinced me that I was documenting something far exceeding my initial artistic intent. However, rather than fleeing, I found myself captivated by the potential. As a photographer, I've always been drawn to subjects that question common perceptions of reality, and I realized that I was potentially documenting reported phenomena, rarely captured with contemporary gear. I decided to focus my remaining time at Cave Hill on a particular section of the graveyard that pulsed with the strongest paranormal energy, an area containing multiple family crypts from the 1870s and 1880s. These structures represented the zenith of Victorian funerary design, with their intricate stone masonry, stained glass, and inner chambers meant for perpetual rest for entire family lines. According to the historical research I had conducted, several of these mausoleums housed the remains of families who had experienced profound losses, including many child deaths from epidemics that had swept through Louisville during the late 19th century. As I set up my equipment near the Harrington family crypt, holding the remains of 5 children lost to an 1882 diphtheria outbreak, I experienced the most profound paranormal experience of my professional life. The temperature near the crypt plunged so sharply that my breath materialized and frost coated my gear, despite the mild and humid October night. The mist that had softly drifted through the cemetery all evening began to churn and condense around the mausoleum in formations that defied normal airflow. I began taking pictures as rapidly as my gear permitted, capturing frame after frame of the intensifying phenomena. The images showed not just the semi-transparent figures I had been documenting, but what appeared to be a congregation of spirits around the crypt. The figures seemed to be engaging with one another and the physical edifice, creating a scene that appeared like a family gathering, or a memorial event taking place in a dimension that ran parallel to our tangible world. The pinnacle moment of the night occurred when I was preparing for what I intended to be my final photograph. I had set up a complex long exposure shot designed to capture the whole crypt complex, using various lighting setups to sculpt shadows and emphasize architectural elements. As I pressed the shutter release to begin the 30-second exposure, all my electronic devices failed at once. Camera flashes discharged without activation, LCDs pulsed and showed incomprehensible visuals, and batteries that had been fully charged moments earlier were abruptly depleted. When I reviewed the final photograph the next morning, I discovered that my camera had captured something that still remains unexplainable. The image showed the mausoleum surrounded by scores of semi-transparent figures, adults and children alike, all clearly visible and seemingly posing intentionally for the shot. Their faces, while ghostly and somewhat indistinct, expressed a spectrum of emotions from sorrow to peace to what might have been thankfulness. Most remarkably, several of the figures appeared to be looking directly at the camera, as if conscious of being photographed and wishing their presence to be duly recorded. The experience at Cave Hill Cemetery profoundly altered both my photographic method and my comprehension of the relationship between art and the supernatural. What had begun as a conventional fine art photography project blurred the lines between factual record and spiritual quest. The photographs I captured that night became the centerpiece of my master's thesis exhibition, though I showcased them as artistic interpretations, not as definitive proof of paranormal phenomena. Since that October evening, I have returned to Cave Hill Cemetery numerous times, always with respect for both the artistic possibilities and the spiritual significance of the place. Each visit has yielded more images that record continued paranormal occurrences, though never again with the intensity of that first night. I have also expanded my long-term endeavor to photograph historic Southern cemeteries to include other locations where similar phenomena have been reported, creating a growing archive of images that suggests the veil between life and death is far thinner than most people realize. The photographs from Cave Hill Cemetery have been exhibited in galleries across the Southeast and garnered interest from both art critics and investigators of the supernatural. While I maintain my focus on the aesthetic value of the work, I cannot deny that the images document phenomena that transcend traditional photographic scope. They serve as a connection between the mortal realm and whatever endures after death, captured through the distinct viewpoint only a camera lens can offer. My work has taught me that cemeteries are not mere resting places for the departed, but vibrant arenas where memory, feeling, and perhaps even consciousness persist in forms we are only beginning to understand. Through photography, I have been privileged to record proof of this ongoing existence, celebrating both the Gothic photography tradition and the deep enigma of what lies past the threshold of death. Rebecca Thompson here. For the past 15 years, genealogy research hasn't just been my profession. It's been the driving force of my life, a profound passion. I pour countless hours into unearthing family histories, meticulously sifting through dusty old records and exploring forgotten cemeteries across the country. My goal is always the same: to bring to life the narratives of people who might otherwise vanish into the mists of time. It's a calling that beautifully blends the thrill of historical investigation with the painstaking work of meticulous research, all fueled by a deep reverence for those who came before us. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I encountered at Eastern Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. That experience completely redefined how I understood the very echoes of history. My journey to Kentucky began in the spring of 2022, prompted by a touching request from Margaret Whitfield, an elderly woman residing in Portland. She yearned to trace her maternal lineage back to its roots in Kentucky, specifically to the 1840s. Margaret carried fragments of family lore about relatives who'd settled in Louisville, but tragically, a house fire decades earlier had consumed all her precious family documents. Her heart was set on finding the final resting places of her great-great-grandparents, William and Catherine Morrison, Irish immigrants rumored to have run a small tobacco farm just outside Louisville. I was instantly captivated by the challenge. Kentucky genealogy, especially from that era, is notoriously complex, plagued by incomplete Civil War records and the intricate migrations of its early settlers. I dedicated 3 intensive weeks to preparation, meticulously gathering every scrap of existing documentation and mapping out the precise locations I'd need to explore. Eastern Cemetery, repeatedly surfacing in my research as a primary burial ground for Irish immigrant families of that period, quickly emerged as a central focus of my investigation. Eastern Cemetery, a historic site established in 1838, sprawled across nearly 300 acres of rolling hills on Louisville's outskirts. As I guided my car through its ornate iron gates on a muted gray October morning, the sheer scale of the place immediately struck me. Thousands upon thousands of markers dotted the vast landscape, ranging from grand, elaborate Victorian memorials to simple, humble stone slabs, many weathered by time into near illegibility. The entire cemetery exuded an undeniable aura of antiquity and collective grief, a palpable heaviness that felt as if it pressed down on everything within its silent boundaries. I approached my work methodically, as always, beginning with the more recent burials and systematically tracing my way back through time, deeper into the cemetery's history, towards the oldest graves. My equipment was standard for on-site research: a high-resolution digital camera to meticulously document headstones, a laptop humming with genealogy software, detailed cemetery maps, and trusty notebooks for capturing any information that simply couldn't be digitized. Years of experience had taught me the absolute necessity of thoroughness and precision. Often, cemetery research provides the only tangible proof a life was ever lived. The first few hours unfolded routinely. I successfully located and carefully documented several graves belonging to Irish families who had arrived in Louisville during the same period as the Morrisons, gathering valuable context for the broader patterns of Irish migration in the region. But as I ventured deeper into the older sections, something peculiar began to catch my eye. Something unlike anything I had ever witnessed in my 15 years of cemetery work. Many of the graves I was documenting bore freshly picked wildflowers. While there were no other signs of recent visitors, these weren't the neatly arranged bouquets typically left by grieving family members. Instead, they were modest gatherings of native Kentucky blooms, looking as if they'd been gathered that very morning, placed with an undeniable care, not scattered randomly. And curiously, they appeared only on graves dating from the 1840s and 1850s. I made a mental note to inquire with the cemetery staff about any volunteer groups maintaining these older plots, though the seemingly random selection of which graves had flowers hinted that it wasn't a coordinated human effort. By mid-afternoon, my research had led me to the section of Eastern Cemetery most likely to contain the Morrison graves. According to the interment records I'd painstakingly acquired from the Louisville Metro Archives, this area was significantly older and far more heavily overgrown than any section I'd explored earlier. Headstones leaned precariously, some nearly swallowed by the earth, and the faint paths between graves were almost entirely obscured by years of fallen leaves and dense undergrowth. It was in this deeply secluded area that I first began to feel something profoundly unsettling, a palpable heaviness, radiating not just from the atmosphere, but seemingly from the very earth beneath my feet. A distinct, unnatural chill permeated the air as I ventured deeper, utterly baffling given the mild October day and the complete absence of wind. Even more disturbing, sounds here seemed strangely muted, deadened, as if the air itself had grown denser, resisting and absorbing all noise. I was meticulously photographing a particularly weathered headstone when I first heard them, voices whispering in what sounded like hushed conversation just at the very edge of my hearing. The words themselves were faint, indistinct, yet the rhythm and tone were unmistakably human. I immediately stopped working, holding my breath, and listened intently, straining to pinpoint their source. The vast cemetery appeared utterly deserted save for me. Yet, unsettlingly, the voices seemed to emanate from multiple directions at once. My initial, logical instinct was to dismiss it. Perhaps sonic distortions created by the cemetery's unique layout, or distant conversations carried and warped from the road by a wayward breeze. However, as I cautiously resumed my work, the voices grew more persistent, and bizarrely, they seemed to follow my movements between the graves. They remained just quiet enough to defy individual comprehension, but loud enough, persistent enough, that I simply couldn't dismiss them as mere imagination. Around 4 p.m., my reliable electronic gear began to stage a coordinated rebellion. My camera, which had performed flawlessly all day, suddenly flashed error messages and devoured fresh batteries at an alarming rate, draining them within minutes. My laptop mirrored its defiance, crashing repeatedly and displaying utterly jumbled data. While the technical difficulties were undeniably frustrating, what truly disturbed me, sending a cold shiver down my spine, was the discovery that my own handwritten notes were being tampered with. Pages in my meticulously kept notebook, written just hours earlier, showed undeniable signs of alteration, text smudged as if by damp, unseen hands. Strange additional marks I certainly hadn't made. And in one particularly unnerving instance, an entire page seemed to have been torn out and replaced with a pristine, blank sheet. I am nothing if not fastidious about my notes, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that these changes were not my doing. As the afternoon deepened, I found myself increasingly hesitant, almost instinctively, to venture into certain parts of the cemetery. In these specific spots, the previously unsettling, oppressive feeling intensified, growing almost intolerable. It was accompanied by an undeniable sense of being watched, scrutinized from all sides. These disturbing sensations were strongest near a cluster of unmarked graves, plots that, according to my research, most likely held the forgotten remains of Irish immigrants who had perished during the devastating cholera epidemic of 1849. It was near these very unmarked graves that I experienced the most profoundly unsettling event of my entire time at Eastern Cemetery. I was crouched low beside a crumbling headstone, painstakingly trying to decipher a faded inscription, when I felt it. A distinct, warm, moist breath on the back of my neck. It was unmistakably human, and so incredibly close that whoever was exhaling should have been physically touching me. I whirled around instantly, my heart leaping, fully expecting to confront another presence that had somehow approached without a sound. But the path behind me was utterly, eerily empty. The sensation of being breathed upon was so startlingly real, so undeniable, that I spent several frantic minutes scrutinizing the area, searching desperately for any logical explanation. There were no other people visible anywhere in the vast cemetery, no animals to possibly account for the sensation, and certainly no natural phenomena that could create the illusion of human breath. Yet the experience had been as tangible, as unmistakably there, as any living human interaction. As evening began to draw in, casting long shadows, I resolved to make one final determined effort to locate the Morrison family graves. The burial records indicated they should be found in a section that had become incredibly overgrown, long since inaccessible by the main cemetery paths. Gathering my few remaining functional pieces of equipment, I plunged into what felt like a truly wild, untamed wilderness within the cemetery's very boundaries. This area was unlike anything I had ever encountered in all my years of genealogy work. The trees formed such an impossibly thick canopy that barely any light pierced through to the ground, creating an environment that felt far more like a deep ancient forest than a consecrated burial ground. The graves here were predominantly unmarked or indicated only by crude field stones, and the ground was treacherous, uneven underfoot. It was starkly clear that this entire section had been utterly neglected by the cemetery staff for years, perhaps even decades. And it was in this forgotten, almost primeval corner of Eastern Cemetery that I finally found what I had been searching for. Partly obscured by fallen limbs and dense Virginia creeper, I discovered 2 weathered headstones. They bore the names William Morrison and Catherine Morrison, their dates precisely matching my meticulous research. The stones were in poor condition but still legible, and a profound wave of professional gratification washed over me, the joy of solving a complex genealogical mystery. Yet that moment of triumph was tragically fleeting. As I knelt beside Catherine Morrison's grave, camera in hand, ready to document the inscription, I heard a sound I will carry with me forever. A woman's voice, clear, sharp, it called my name. Not a shout, not a yell, but a conversational tone, as if she stood right beside me, seeking my undivided attention. "Rebecca," she said, with a cadence and warmth that unnervingly echoed my own grandmother's voice. My head snapped up from the camera, and there she was, a woman dressed in a long flowing gray gown, standing less than 10 feet away. She appeared middle-aged, her dark hair pulled back severely, her face etched with an expression of profound melancholy. Her attire was unmistakably vintage, the high neckline and long sleeves characteristic of mid-19th century morning wear. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, our eyes locked. Then she was gone, not walking away, not fading gradually, but simply vanished, as if she had never been there at all. I scrambled to my feet so quickly I nearly toppled backward over the headstone, my heart hammering against my ribs with a terrifying blend of terror and disbelief. I frantically scanned the spot where she had stood just moments before. No footprints disturbed the soft earth. No vegetation was bent or broken. Absolutely no sign that anyone had ever been there. My hands trembling violently, I gathered my equipment and practically stumbled, rather than walked, back toward the main cemetery paths. But as I navigated the dense, overgrown section, a chilling realization washed over me. I was not alone. Shapes flickered and moved between the ancient trees, always just at the edge of my peripheral vision, always vanishing the instant I tried to look directly. The faint voices I had been hearing all day now seemed more numerous, more distinct, a cacophony of hushed murmurs, though still utterly impossible to decipher. By the time I finally reached my car, night had completely enveloped the cemetery, and I was teetering on the precipice of full-blown panic, a state I had never, ever experienced in my 15 years of professional work. I sank into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, and sat there for a solid 20 minutes, attempting desperately to process the impossible events I'd just witnessed. The question burned in my mind, should I report this? But who, I thought, who would ever credit such a wild story coming from a genealogy researcher whose entire profession was built on irrefutable facts and meticulous documentation? I did, of course, complete Margaret Whitfield's research project, utilizing all the photographs and invaluable information I had gathered at Eastern Cemetery. I never, not once, mentioned the paranormal elements of my visit to her. The Morrison family graves were exactly where I'd found them, and the comprehensive documentation I provided allowed her to definitively establish the connection to her Kentucky ancestors she had so longed for. Yet for me, that day fundamentally altered my entire methodology for genealogy research. I simply no longer work alone in cemeteries, especially older ones, and I strictly limit my visits to daylight hours whenever humanly possible. More profoundly, though, I've developed an entirely new, deeper understanding of the enduring emotional ties that persist between families, spanning the vast chasm of death and time. I truly believe that what I encountered at Eastern Cemetery was not just an eerie experience, but tangible evidence of those very connections brought vividly to life. The woman in the gray dress, whom I now believe, with every fiber of my being, was Catherine Morrison herself, wasn't trying to frighten me. No, I believe she was trying to ensure that her narrative, and the narratives of countless others buried in that forgotten, overgrown section, would not simply fade into oblivion. And those recently picked wildflowers I had noticed throughout the day, I no longer think they were placed by living hands. Instead, I see them as poignant memorials, tokens from those whose enduring memories keep the deceased vibrant, reminding us that they are not truly gone. Genealogy research for me has always been about so much more than just names and dates. It's about the sacred task of safeguarding the intricate human narratives that lend such profound significance to our shared history. What Eastern Cemetery taught me, in the most unforgettable way possible, is that sometimes the very people we research are just as keen on safeguarding their tales as we are in discovering them. This profound realization has reshaped my perspective on every dusty archive and every quiet graveyard I visit. Now I approach each site not just as a repository of facts, but as a living tapestry of untold stories, imbued with an almost perceptible energy. There's a certain respect and even deeper reverence that I carry with me now. A silent acknowledgement that these ancestors are not merely subjects of study, but active participants in the preservation of their own legacies. My encounter at Eastern Cemetery transformed me from a researcher into a guardian, dedicated not only to uncovering the past, but to honoring the enduring presence of those who shaped it. It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just something to be found in books. It often lingers, whispers, and even breathes, waiting for someone to truly listen and carry its echoes forward. My name is Ashley Martinez, and this story takes me back to when I was just 17, living in Phoenix, Arizona. At that age, I genuinely believed I was invincible. I never backed down from a dare, always loved to show off my fearlessness, and had earned quite a reputation as the brave one in our group, ready to tackle any challenge without a second thought. During our senior year of high school in 2021, my friends and I became obsessed with exploring abandoned places in what we called fear dares. We'd challenge each other to spend time alone in supposedly haunted spots around Phoenix, decaying buildings, old hospitals, and sometimes even cemeteries. These adventures always happened at night, and we treated them like a game, competing to see who could last the longest in the scariest locations. Looking back now, I can clearly see how reckless and disrespectful our actions were. But at 17, these challenges felt like the ultimate test of bravery. The dare that changed everything came in mid-October, just 2 weeks before Halloween. I had mentioned to my friends that I would be spending Halloween week in Louisville, Kentucky, visiting my Aunt Maria, who had moved there the year before for work. The moment I told them about my travel plans, my best friend Jessica's eyes sparkled with mischief. She'd been researching supposedly haunted locations across the country for her psychology class project on urban legends. And Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville had popped up on multiple lists as one of America's most actively haunted cemeteries. The challenge she proposed seemed simple enough. Spend exactly 1 hour alone in Cave Hill Cemetery after total darkness had fallen, capture photographic proof of my visit, and endure any paranormal events. The rules were strict and non-negotiable. No external lights beyond my phone's camera flash, no cell phones for calls, no contingency plans, and absolutely no leaving before the full hour was up. To make it even tougher, I had to venture so deep into the cemetery that the entrance and streetlights were completely out of sight from my chosen spot. When I arrived in Louisville, I spent the first few days researching Cave Hill Cemetery and meticulously planning my approach to the challenge. The cemetery, established in 1848, was immense, sprawling across 296 acres and holding over 120,000 souls, including many famous figures from Kentucky history. What struck me most during my daytime scouting trips was its sheer vastness and intricate layout. Unlike the smaller, more manageable cemeteries I knew in Phoenix, Cave Hill felt like a miniature city of the departed, with winding paths, distinct sections from different historical periods, and natural features creating endless hidden nooks where someone could easily get disoriented or lost. On Halloween night, I told my aunt I was going to a party with some local friends I'd met, which was partly true, as I had connected with a few people through social media who were interested in Louisville's paranormal history. However, instead of any party, I drove to Cave Hill Cemetery at 9:30 p.m., timing my arrival so that total darkness would have completely enveloped the grounds by the time I began my challenge. The October night was crisp and clear, with only a slender crescent moon offering a faint, ghostly light. As I approached the cemetery's main entrance, I felt that familiar jolt of adrenaline that always accompanied these fear dares. But from the very beginning, something felt different. Unlike the abandoned buildings and urban ruins I'd explored in Phoenix, Cave Hill possessed a deep solemnity, an inherited sorrow that felt like a physical weight pressing against me. I slipped through a gap in the boundary fence instead of using the main gates, which were locked after sunset, and began making my way toward the heart of the cemetery, where the oldest monuments and mausoleums were located. My chosen destination was an area known as the Victorian Quarter, where grand 19th century family crypts formed a landscape like a tiny city made of marble and granite. This area was far enough from any perimeter lighting to ensure complete darkness, and the concentration of memorials would offer compelling photo opportunities for my documentation requirements. The first 20 minutes of my hour-long challenge passed uneventfully, though I was immediately struck by the profound quiet that blanketed the cemetery after dark. Unlike the urban environment I was used to in Phoenix, where there was always a background hum of traffic, air conditioning units, and human activity, Cave Hill at night was eerily silent, making every minor sound seem magnified. The occasional whisper of leaves or a faint distant traffic hum seemed to come from another world entirely. I spent the initial part of my time taking photographs of various monuments and mausoleums, using my phone's camera flash to illuminate the elaborate Victorian funerary architecture. The striking contrast of light and shadow created by the abrupt flash in the surrounding darkness produced some truly captivating visuals. I started to think that my friend's challenge might actually result in some remarkable photographic evidence of my bravery, while also creating some memorable artistic images. However, as I moved deeper into the Victorian Quarter and farther from any external light sources, I began to experience phenomena that truly shook my rational skepticism and severely tested my determination to complete the full hour. The first unusual occurrence was a slow but distinct temperature plunge that seemed confined to specific monuments. These cold spots weren't consistent or explainable by typical environmental conditions like elevation or wind patterns. Instead, they were concentrated around particular graves, as if the chill was emanating directly from the burial sites themselves. More disturbing were the sounds that began around the 30-minute mark of my challenge. What started as barely perceptible whispers slowly grew clearer and seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The voices were too faint to understand clearly, but they had the unmistakable rhythm and tone of human speech, as if groups of people were having quiet discussions just beyond the range of my hearing. When I tried to approach the sources of these sounds, they would fade away, only to resume from different locations moments later. The mental toll of these occurrences was far heavier than I had anticipated. Unlike the direct fear I'd felt in previous dares in abandoned buildings, where the danger seemed tangible and controllable, the paranormal aura of Cave Hill bred a deep disquiet that burrowed into my very consciousness. I found myself repeatedly glancing over my shoulder, scrutinizing the shadows between monuments, and wondering if the forms at the edge of my sight were just optical illusions or something far more solid. At approximately 45 minutes into my challenge, I experienced the encounter that would haunt me for years afterward. I was photographing an ornate family crypt belonging to the Whitman lineage when I heard my name being called in a voice that was distinctly feminine, yet possessed an unearthly quality that made my blood freeze. The voice wasn't shouting or urgent, but spoke my name with a soft persistence that implied acquaintance, as if whoever was calling knew me personally and sought my attention for an important reason. I called out in response, asking who was there and whether someone needed help, but received no answer. Instead, the air around me dropped so sharply that my breath became visible in the suddenly freezing air, and a fog started to emerge from the earth around the Whitman mausoleum. The fog swirled in patterns that defied natural airflow, concentrating in ways that seemed purposeful rather than random. It was within this supernatural mist that I saw her, a white figure, seemingly a young woman dressed in a Victorian-era gown. She stood approximately 30 feet away from me, near a cluster of smaller headstones that marked the graves of children who had died during an 1880s diphtheria epidemic. The figure was semi-transparent yet sharply outlined, with dark, flowing hair that swayed without any perceptible breeze, and eyes that seemed to gaze directly at me with an expression of deep melancholy. For several moments that felt like an eternity, we gazed at each other across the foggy graveyard. She slowly lifted an arm, gesturing towards a small, unmarked grave behind me, then mouthed words I couldn't hear, yet somehow instinctively comprehended. She was attempting to convey a message about the children interred there, something about their demise and the unquiet sorrow that had never fully been laid to rest. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, but its emotional impact was overwhelming. I felt consumed by a sorrow that wasn't mine, experiencing what seemed to be the collective anguish of generations of grieving parents who had lost children, families shattered by illness and misfortune, and individuals who had died far from home and loved ones. The intensity of these emotions was so powerful that I cried profusely, though I couldn't explain why. When the specter finally receded, slowly melting back into the fog until nothing remained but the normal darkness of the cemetery, I felt tremulous and emotionally drained. I spent the remaining few minutes of my hour-long challenge cowering against the Whitman Mausoleum's cold stone, having lost all interest in photos or bravado, simply trying to absorb the experience and regain my composure until I could finally leave. The photographs I captured that night contain unexplained irregularities that I have never been able to truly explain. Several images show mysterious lights and shadows that were invisible to my bare eyes during the actual photography session. Others display what appear to be ghostly human forms in the background, though they are so faint that a skeptic might dismiss them as pareidolia or camera glitches. Most significantly, one photograph taken near the children's graves clearly shows the white figure I encountered, though she appears even more spectral in the photo than she did in person. This particular photograph has been examined by several people proficient in digital imaging, and none have been able to identify any technical explanation for the strange figure that appears in the image. The experience at Cave Hill Cemetery profoundly altered my views on fear, mortality, and the supernatural. I came back to Phoenix a truly changed person, no longer seeking to prove courage through risky stunts. I was now acutely aware that reality encompasses far more than our conventional comprehension. The encounter taught me that some places hold stored emotional energy that can manifest in ways that bridge the past and present, connecting the living and the dead. I have never participated in another Fear Dare since that Halloween night, and I have never returned to Cave Hill Cemetery, despite having visited Louisville several times in subsequent years. The memory of that encounter remains vivid and powerful, serving as a constant reminder that reverence for the deceased and sacred spaces is not merely a social custom, but a spiritual imperative. When my friends ask me about that night and whether I successfully fulfilled their dare, I tell them that yes, I did spend the full hour alone in Cave Hill Cemetery, but I also explain that some experiences transform you, making your prior motivations for seeking them seem petty and childish. I learned that genuine courage isn't fearlessness, but facing the unknown with respect and modesty, even when it challenges everything you thought you understood about the world. My name is Professor James Mitchell, and I teach American history at Boston University, specializing in the Civil War era. For the past 30 years, I've dedicated my academic career to investigating and chronicling the lives of soldiers and civilians during our nation's most profound conflict. My work has led me to countless battlefields, archives, and cemeteries across the South and Midwest. Yet, nothing in my extensive research could have prepared me for what I discovered at Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky, during the winter of 2022. I had traveled to Louisville as part of a larger research project, examining the funerary customs and remembrance of Civil War soldiers in border regions. Kentucky's unique role during the war, officially neutral, yet supplying soldiers to both Union and Confederate armies, introduced intriguing complexities into how the dead from both sides were honored and remembered. Cave Hill Cemetery, established in 1848, was a crucial site, housing nearly 6,000 Civil War veterans from both armies. The cemetery's Civil War section stretched across several acres in the older part of the grounds, with graves aligned with a military precision that reflected their martial service. Union soldiers were buried in one area, Confederate soldiers in another. Yet the sheer proximity of these burial sections created a moving, poignant reminder that young men who might have once clashed fiercely across battlefields now lay mere yards away from each other in death. The headstones themselves narrate tales of immense sacrifice, entire companies ravaged by illness, young men who died far from home, and officers whose service concluded on muddy battlefields across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia. My research usually involved spending multiple days at each site, meticulously documenting headstones, deciphering faded inscriptions, and cross-referencing interment records with military papers. This systematic method had proven effective throughout my career, allowing me to author numerous respected academic articles on Civil War memorial practices and their evolution over the years. However, Cave Hill Cemetery presented obstacles that far exceeded typical historical inquiry. From my very first day working in the Civil War section, I began to notice weather phenomena that defied typical meteorological explanation. Despite visiting during a usually temperate Kentucky January, certain areas of the cemetery experienced sudden temperature drops, so intense they would reveal my breath and frost my gear. These cold spots weren't scattered haphazardly. Instead, they appeared focused around specific graves, particularly those belonging to soldiers who had fallen in combat rather than from illness or injury in field hospitals. More perplexing were the auditory phenomena that began on my second day of research. While I was intently studying markers in the Confederate area, I began hearing what sounded like faint, rhythmic, and purposeful drumming, yet with no discernible origin. The sound was far too consistent and prolonged to be attributed to construction or traffic noise, and it truly seemed to radiate from the earth itself rather than from any external location. When I asked the cemetery staff about possible renovation work or nearby construction that might account for the noise, they confirmed that no such activities were taking place anywhere in the vicinity. The drumming sounds were often accompanied by what I can only describe as the faint murmur of human speech, though the words were unclear and seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. As a historian accustomed to working alone in quiet archives and libraries, I initially attributed these phenomena to the sonic characteristics of the graveyard, or perhaps my own mind working overtime in the somber setting. However, as the noises continued and grew clearer, I simply couldn't attribute them to environmental influences or mental suggestion any longer. On the third day of my research, while documenting the marker of a young private from the 5th Kentucky Infantry Regiment who had died at the Battle of Stones River, I experienced my initial visual evidence of the paranormal energies at work in Cave Hill Cemetery. I was photographing the headstone when I noticed the movement at the very edge of my sight. When I looked up from my camera, I saw a figure in what appeared to be Civil War military attire standing approximately 50 yards away, near a cluster of graves belonging to members of the same regiment. The figure was semi-transparent yet sharply delineated, wearing the dark blue uniform and kepi cap characteristic of Union infantry. He stood at parade rest, as if on watch, facing directly toward the Confederate section of the cemetery. Most remarkably, he appeared to be a young man, probably no older than 20, with a slender build and a somber countenance reminiscent of countless Civil War photographs. For several moments we exchanged gazes across the graveyard vista, and I had the undeniable sense that he perceived me as readily as I perceived him. When I attempted to approach the figure, he slowly dissolved until only the normal winter landscape of the cemetery remained. However, this encounter marked the commencement of more frequent and potent paranormal experiences that would fundamentally reshape my perspective on historical inquiry and the profound relationship between past and present. Over the following days, I began to see multiple figures throughout the Civil War section, always manifesting during daylight as I actively pursued my research. They wore attire from both armies, appearing in diverse ages and ranks, from youthful drummer boys to seasoned sergeants with faces etched by long campaigns and hard service. Most appeared engaged in military tasks, standing guard, marching in formation, or simply observing the cemetery grounds with the alert attention of soldiers on duty. What struck me most about these apparitions was their mutual awareness and apparent disregard for the political schisms that had defined their mortal lives. I observed Union and Confederate soldiers occupying the same spaces, sometimes even seeming to engage with each other, hinting at camaraderie rather than hostility. This ethereal reconciliation was profoundly moving to witness, symbolizing a healing beyond the harsh divisions that had torn the nation apart during their lifetimes. The most remarkable encounter happened on my last day of research at Cave Hill Cemetery. I was completing my records of a section holding graves of soldiers from the Battle of Perryville, Kentucky's most significant Civil War engagement, when I heard the distinct sound of marching boots drawing near across the cemetery grounds. The sound grew louder and clearer, accompanied by the clatter of gear and the soft hum of soldiers conversing, much as men do during long marches. I looked up from my work to see a full company of soldiers, both Union and Confederate, advancing in open formation along the cemetery's main pathway. They appeared to be moving towards the Civil War section's core, where a grand memorial monument honors all soldiers buried in Cave Hill, regardless of their allegiance. The procession included soldiers of all ages and ranks, some shouldering rifles, others carrying regimental flags that lay still in the frigid winter air. As they passed near my location, several of the soldiers turned to look at me directly, acknowledging my presence with a nod or a subtle salute. One figure, an officer, a Union colonel, detached himself from the formation and approached me. He was a middle-aged man with a full beard and the unmistakable demeanor of a man of authority. When he spoke, his voice was lucid, yet seemed to emanate from afar, as if he was calling across a vast expanse. He told me that they valued my efforts in safeguarding their stories and ensuring their service and sacrifice weren't forgotten by future generations. He explained that they had been awaiting someone who truly grasped the weight of their experience and could convey their message to the living. The war that had divided them in life, he said, had been resolved in death, and they now stood together as brothers who had served their country according to their conscience and the circumstances of their time. The colonel asked me to impart to others that the animosity and hatred that had characterized the Civil War period had evolved into mutual respect and understanding. The soldiers buried at Cave Hill, regardless of the color of their uniforms, were united in their desire to be remembered not as enemies, but as young men who had heeded their nation's summons, even when that call led them to fight against fellow Americans who shared their fundamental values and aspirations. This message, delivered by a supernatural messenger in a Louisville cemetery, deeply reshaped my perspective on Civil War history. I realized that my scholarly emphasis on military tactics, political origins, and statistical data had inadvertently missed the fundamental human aspect of the conflict. The common ordeal of young men pushed into uncontrollable situations, battling for causes they might not have fully grasped, yet bound by duty and love for their nation. When the colonel finished speaking, he formally saluted and rejoined the ranks, which continued its solemn march toward the central memorial. I watched until the entire procession vanished from sight, leaving me alone among the markers, feeling I'd witnessed something truly hallowed and historically vital. The experience at Cave Hill Cemetery led me to publish a paper titled Reconciliation Beyond the Grave: Paranormal Encounters and Historical Insight in the Journal of American History. Though I portrayed the paranormal aspects as allegorical rather than factual experiences, a necessity for academic credibility, the paper powerfully advocated for a more empathetic approach to Civil War scholarship that highlights the common experiences and ultimate reconciliation of Americans who were temporarily divided by political and regional differences. However, the real import of my Cave Hill encounter surpasses mere academic study. It demonstrated that historical research is not simply about documenting facts and analyzing data, but about profoundly connecting with the human journeys that lend significance to historical events. The soldiers I encountered in that Louisville cemetery were not just historical figures, but genuine individuals whose narratives echo across the centuries, desiring acknowledgement and comprehension from those who inherited their nation. Since that winter day in 2022, I have returned to Cave Hill Cemetery several times, always hoping to encounter the soldiers again. While I have not witnessed manifestations as vivid as that first research visit, I continue to feel their tangible presence among the markers, eternally safeguarding the memory of their service and the profound wisdom their experiences offer on duty, sacrifice, and the potential for reconciliation even after the most bitter conflicts. My work at Cave Hill Cemetery taught me that history isn't just in books and archives, but thrives in places of momentous events and in the living spirits of those who shaped our national story. The Civil War soldiers buried in that Louisville cemetery represent more than numbers or strategic points. They are distinct individuals whose experiences continue to speak across the ages, providing invaluable insight into the price of division and the enduring prospect of healing. This understanding has utterly redefined my pedagogy and investigations, leading me to underscore the personal facets of historical events and to encourage my students to perceive history not as abstract ideas, but as the collective experience of real individuals who face challenges remarkably similar to those we face today. The insights from my paranormal encounters at Cave Hill Cemetery have enriched me immeasurably, both as a historian and as a person, demonstrating that the lines between past and present are far more porous than most people realize. These two accounts, though separated by time and purpose, converge powerfully within the solemn grounds of Cave Hill Cemetery. Ashley's youthful quest for bravado unwittingly tapped into a reservoir of lingering emotion, discovering that true fear lay not in jump scares, but in the profound, shared sorrow of the past. Her transformation from reckless thrill-seeker to a person of deep reverence speaks volumes about the capacity of such places to impart wisdom. Professor Mitchell, on the other hand, approached with scholarly rigor, only to find his academic framework expanded by the very spirits he sought to study. His encounters highlight how history is not just a collection of facts, but a living narrative, actively seeking to communicate with those open enough to listen. Both narratives underscore that certain locations are more than just geographical points. They are custodians of memory, imbued with the emotional residue of countless lives. They remind us that the veil between worlds can indeed thin, allowing glimpses of profound truths about human experience, resilience, and the eternal yearning for understanding and peace. These stories challenge our conventional understandings of reality, encouraging us to consider that perhaps the most valuable lessons are those whispered by the past, in spaces where time itself seems to bend, and where the echoes of human joy and sorrow resonate with astonishing clarity. This intersection of personal transformation and historical revelation, sparked by encounters with the unexplained, offers a compelling argument for humility in the face of the unknown and respect for the profound power of memory. My name is Linda Evans, and for over a dozen years, my heart has been deeply invested as a volunteer with the Pacific Northwest Historical Preservation Society. My journey in gravestone restoration has taken me across the nation, guiding me to neglected graveyards and the poignant task of mending damaged headstones, the final silent records of countless lost lives. Our organization firmly believes that these stone monuments are far more than just markers of death. They are crucial historical links, whispering stories that deserve protection so that future generations can grasp their legacy and truly understand the lives and experiences of those who walked this earth before us. In the crisp fall of 2022, a compelling request arrived from the Kentucky Historical Society. They needed our help with a project at Fairview Cemetery, a humble rural graveyard nestled about 15 miles southeast of Bowling Green. This sacred ground, founded in 1823 by the resilient pioneer families of what was then a frontier outpost, had sadly deteriorated significantly over recent decades. Many headstones lay toppled by relentless storms, shattered by thoughtless vandalism, or simply eroded by Kentucky's unforgiving climate and years of abandonment. The local community, while lacking the specialized means and skills for proper restoration, was fiercely determined to safeguard their ancestors' last resting place. Our team was a small but mighty crew of 8 volunteers, each bringing a unique expertise essential for a comprehensive cemetery restoration. As the project coordinator, I leaned heavily on my background in historical preservation and art history. Mark Patterson, a retired carpenter from Lexington, was a godsend with his profound knowledge of stonemasonry and structural mending. Sarah Henderson, a bright archaeology graduate student from the UK, provided invaluable insight into correct excavation methods and meticulous historical recording. Our diverse team also included a retired librarian, a true specialist in genealogy, 2 seasoned stoneworkers, a dedicated photographer capturing every stage of our progress, and a local historian from Bowling Green, who served as our vital link to the community. When we arrived at Fairview Cemetery on that sharp October morning, the reason for the local residents' desperate plea for professional help became immediately, painfully clear. The cemetery stretched across roughly 3 acres of Kentucky's gently rolling landscape, embraced by ancient oak and maple trees that formed a natural, poignant boundary between the hallowed ground and the adjacent farmland. However, decades of profound neglect had allowed encroaching vegetation to swallow much of the area. Many headstones were either completely hidden by dense overgrowth, their stories obscured, or dislodged by tenacious root systems and relentless soil runoff. The cemetery itself was a silent testament to nearly 2 centuries of local lore, holding interments from the initial pioneer families of the 1820s right up to residents who passed in the 1990s. Our primary restoration focus was the oldest sector, containing approximately 60 graves belonging to the founding families and their descendants, including numerous veterans from the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and both factions of the Civil War. Many of these early markers, beautifully weathered over time, were crafted from native limestone, a material susceptible to acid rain and organic growth that had, sadly, blurred their delicate inscriptions. Our restoration approach was deeply respectful, meticulously adhering to the established preservation guidelines developed by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Each day began with a careful ritual, thoroughly documenting the current state of each headstone through detailed photography and comprehensive written evaluations. Next, we would undertake the painstaking task of cleaning away accumulated grime, stubborn lichen, and organic material using specialized tools and gentle solutions specifically designed not to harm the original stone. When necessary, we would carefully re-erect fallen stones, always utilizing period-appropriate materials and methods, not only to preserve their historical accuracy, but also to guarantee their lasting stability for generations to come. During our very first day of work, my heart was drawn to a group of graves in that oldest section, where the original pioneer families rested beneath plain limestone markers. Though unadorned, these stones held vital genealogical data. Working alongside Mark and Sarah, I began the painstaking process of removing decades of amassed debris from around the headstones, then gently cleaning their surfaces to reveal the faded, yet still legible, inscriptions etched into the stone. The work was physically demanding, requiring patience and precision, but it was profoundly spiritually gratifying. With each cleaned marker, we unveiled the name and dates of someone whose life had undeniably shaped the local community. We uncovered the graves of diligent farmers, skilled artisans, mothers lost in childbirth, and countless children who succumbed to the diseases that relentlessly ravaged frontier communities. Each inscription was a window into a tale of tribulation, deep sorrow, and the extraordinary resilience of people who forged lives in what was then America's western frontier. However, as our work advanced deeper into the restoration project, something shifted. Our team began experiencing occurrences that defied our scientific methods for historical preservation, stirring a sense of wonder and perhaps a touch of unease. The first truly unusual event happened on our second day. I was kneeling beside a particularly weathered headstone belonging to Martha Coleman, who had died in 1847 at the tender age of 20, and as I worked, I heard clear footsteps trailing me distinctly, though I was utterly alone in that quiet corner of the cemetery. This work, far more than simply cleaning stones, is a profound act of remembrance. It's about listening to the land, deciphering the silent language of the past, and giving voice to those whose stories might otherwise be forgotten beneath layers of earth and time. Each inscription brought to light isn't just a name and a date. It's a life, a dream, a struggle, a love. In these forgotten cemeteries, we don't just restore monuments. We restore memory, dignity, and a vital connection to our shared human narrative. There's an almost sacred responsibility in touching these ancient markers, feeling the rough texture of stone carved by hands long gone, knowing that for a moment you are holding a piece of history, an echo of a soul, the faint whispers of unexplained sounds, the gentle shift in the air. They only deepen the sense that we are not alone in this work, that the spirits of those we are tending are, in their own way, acknowledging our presence, grateful for the care we offer their final resting places. It transforms a historical project into a deeply personal dialogue with eternity.